Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Claret and Blue with myself, Matt Kendrick, and I'm joined by, I know I always call you financial guru, Dave. I'm not sure how comfortable you are with the word guru, but it seems to fit. This is Dave Powell. It's not your first time on Claret and Blue, so you'll be well known to our listeners and our viewers. Business of football guru, Dave. So who better to talk to at this time of this extra transfer deadline day than your good self? Welcome aboard.
I appreciate the guru. I do. I'm not too sure how apt it is, but I appreciate it. Yeah, no, I always enjoy coming on. I think Villa's a really interesting tale from a financial perspective at the moment. It has been for a little while because they are so upwardly mobile. So I'm looking forward to chatting about a whole host of PSR complications, I'm sure.
Who'd have thought that all these abbreviations and all this business talk would have all of a sudden become so fascinating and interesting? It's weird, isn't it, the way that football develops?
It's part of the industry vernacular now.
I mentioned, during the intro that it's an extra transfer deadline day, potentially. We're probably whipping it up to something more than it is. So we're not going to get the older Jim White yellow ties out and that kind of thing. But we are going to see June the 30th, 2024 has become a significant date in the Premier League diary. Can you just talk to us a little bit about why that is?
The short answer is it's the end of the financial year for most Premier League teams, not all, but most. Usually it would be Villa's financial end of financial year would have been the end of May, but they've extended it to 13 months. They did that earlier part of this year. So theirs finishes on 30th of June. So basically it's the last final knock-ins of a financial year whereby you can raise revenue through player trading now. For the most part, all your commercial revenues are already in. You've had all your season ticket money from the previous season, or your prize money. So the only thing left, really, the levers to pull is player trading. So for any clubs that find themselves potential concerns about breaching PSR in the Premier League, which has taken on greater significance this summer, I think, because we've seen two episodes of point deductions for Everton, one for Nottingham Forest, and Leicester will come up with they'll be starting behind the rest, I imagine. So yeah, so it's the last few days now where clubs can actually raise funds that would appear, they can book into their accounts to make their picture a little bit healthier and alleviate any PSR concerns and profit and sustainability concerns that they may have.
So do you think the fact that we've seen that hard-hitting sanctions that actually can have a tangible effect, do you think that has focused the minds of clubs like Villa? So do you think that was a factor potentially for Villa extending the financial year because it gave them that little bit of extra leeway?
Yeah, I mean, because the transfer window was, there's no way to do business in May. So it's if you're extending that window into a period where you can conduct your business, then that's beneficial. But I do think it has focused minds because previously, I mean, this 105 limit has been in situ since 2012. The idea being that it was supposed to stop us having another episode like Portsmouth when they went into administration. They spent heavily and didn't have the revenue to support that spend. That was the idea behind it. But since then, I mean, we have a thing called inflation. I mentioned this previously in other episodes I've done with Dan. It's not kept pace. The regulation hasn't kept pace with the pace of football growing. I mean, transfer wages have risen exponentially. So transfer fees have risen exponentially. So have wages. The cost of running a football club has gone the same way. So this 105 figure becomes harder and harder to make work every year if you haven't got the revenues to match it, which ultimately stunts growth of those who want to try and break into that kind of little enclave of wealthy teams, which Villa have managed to do last season without spending as much. Everton tried to do it in the early years of Farhad Moshiri, hence the reason why they kind of had to roll with the punches in recent years. So, but what happened with Everton? I mean, they came down hard on them, partly I think because the Premier League wants to show it has some teeth when it comes to regulatory matters, because we've got the white paper and kind of the football governance bill. They don't want powers taken away from them because they feel it will diminish the product of the Premier League on a global scale. So there's that to factor in. But ultimately, I mean, the Premier League have spent £30 million fighting their own clubs in legal fees over the course of the past year. So it's become a real mess. But I do think that the they've already set a precedent for the kind of punishment they will show them, and they've said it's been explicitly laid out in independent commissions over the past 12 months that if you are in breach, you will suffer a points deduction. Now, if you're a mid-table side and you're thinking, well, okay, maybe we can take that this year because we're not going down, squad's strong enough, but we're not troubling the top four, so maybe they make that decision. But for someone like Villa, a points deduction, once you've tried to get part of that, you've latched onto that group to get a 3 or 4 points deduction. That could be the difference between making the Champions League or not, or making European football or not. And the flip side for Everton is that reason why they'll want to work hard to comply, which I think they will, is that they'd be concerned about losing any more points because they know the side's going to be weaker this season. They haven't got the money to strengthen. So the Premier League are painting themselves into a corner, but they know they'll have to follow through on tough sanctions now. So I think it has focused minds, and it will be the reason why everyone's taking this very, very seriously and doing their level best to ensure that they remain within the limits by the time the auditors come and have a snoop.
So regular Claret and Blue followers will know that I love an analogy, and they will also know that I'm a simple creature. So at risk of overstretching this, getting it wrong, and getting you to storm out. In household terms, right, stay with me with this, Dave. I'm struggling. This is a hypothetical situation. I'm struggling to meet my latest mortgage payment. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to sell my favourite unicycle just in time. I'm going to sneak the sale through of that unicycle, possibly whether I inflate the value of that unicycle or not, we don't know. But then what I will do, knowing that I'm now part of an award-winning podcast and my earning potential is going to go up fairly quickly because of that, I can then buy a newer, potentially better unicycle or series of unicycles, which I can then pay off over the course of 5 years in installments.
Claret.
Does that somehow? I mean, it's very forced, but is that?
it's almost elements of false accounting, I suppose. It's like you're trying to make do and mend while you can, but knowing that you can afford something greater the next financial year. But it's rinse and repeat. So it's the same problems occur next year if you can't raise revenues. So it's like saying you'll need to increase your wages or your salary in order to meet those higher costs again next year. That's just the way it is. But obviously, this is the last year we're having PSR in its current form. For this year, we're moving to kind of in line with UEFA's squad cost ratio, which is a whole other thing we can get into. Where it's wages, amortization costs, and agents' fees against transfer revenue less player trading spend. But yeah, I mean, in the short of it, that is. I mean, so you can bring in the money from the unicycle in all its.
Sorry about dragging you down to my level, Dave.
Let's go for it. You can get 100% the unicycle money and buy yourself a new unicycle using Klarna and other monthly pay things available over the life of the next 5 years, and that's effectively it. But bearing in mind that you will have to keep on finding ways to meet those increased monthly annual payments by driving up your revenue. So that's kind of the long and short.
So we're talking about a clutch of clubs. I mean, if I miss anybody out, please add them. We're talking about Aston Villa, Newcastle, Chelsea, Nottingham Forest, Everton, potentially Leicester now arriving in the Premier League as well. Why do they find themselves in this kind of, I suppose, late June scramble? Is it just because they have been kind of pushing that envelope?
Everton's, as I mentioned before, that still has a rollover of the early Farhad Moshiri years of heavy transfer spend. The idea being was that he was trying to artificially close that gap between the middle of the pack and the top six by spending and hoping that Champions League football would come along and save the day, and they would be able to rely on those revenues. And also then, the Russian military invasion of Ukraine happens. They lose some key sponsorship deals, which they've already got commercial agreements with. So they can't sell some of that sponsorship inventory again. So it's only next year or this year and next year they can start selling some of the things they've already sold. So Finch Farm has just been Finch Farm when it was USM Finch Farm, and they were earning money for that. So they've been unable to sell some of this inventory because it was held by Russian companies. But Everton suspended the agreement. It didn't have, the companies could argue that we still have this agreement in place, so you can't sell that inventory to other people. So, and it also comes from spend, but Villa's is spend. So I think it was outlined in the annual accounts that the losses were attributed to the fact that there's been heavier investment in the first team operation. And that, that's correct. And that will, there'll likely be losses again next season or this current financial year, but it's all about whether they can keep them, limit them to a point whereby they can make up the difference through player trading, which is effectively what they've tried to do. They'll know they'll probably make a loss this coming season, this financial year. Well, they will know because the financial year has only got a few days left to run. But that's not. Football clubs aren't profitable. They are loss-making businesses in the main. So that's nothing new. I mean, football clubs, the value for their owners lies in the value of the team creatively over a period of time. So, but yeah, theirs has been down to spend, and they'll have to be clever now for this particular final days of the transfer window to ensure that they don't particularly want to lose someone like Douglas Luiz. They're going to have to now. But I think they've been quite cute in adding more players than they've lost, but having reduced the player trading, having raised more through player trading. And ultimately, I think I mentioned to Dan last time, I think for one of the big things about this was for Villa, because they're going to be fighting on both fronts and also have ideas of trying to replicate what happened last season in the Premier League. It's very difficult when you're winning with a small squad to do both of those things. Newcastle found that a challenge, and the Champions League isn't the Europa Conference League. You're not throwing kids in, really. You are. It's going to be an elite event requiring sellout crowds, playing the best of the best, and it's going to involve experienced players. So to have a deeper rotation in your squad, that's important. But it comes at a cost for Villa, which is unfair. You can see why Nassif Sawiris has taken such issue with it because. I mentioned from the top, the PSR hasn't kept in line with inflation even. So when Villa made their representations to the Premier League and its member clubs that they should be increasing this PSR threshold to 130 million, that's still actually 16 million less than what it would be if it were in line with inflation. So you can make the case for it, but it has to get past. Has to be majority of clubs in the Premier League have to pass these things. So, and it's not always to the benefit of all the clubs to do that. So, but yeah, there's Villa's spend. They didn't have the Grealish money coming in like they had in previous seasons. The impact of COVID has also fallen off. So COVID was an allowable deduction from your PSR. So your 105 million you're allowed to lose. You can lose more. Some clubs could lose 180 million, but if you've invested, Tottenham, heavy losses, heavily in debt, but it's all attributed largely to the stadium. So that's an allowable deduction. You can invest in the academy, the women's team, community projects, all those, they're allowable deductions. So you can lose 200 million if you've invested heavily in those type of things. It's only in relation to the 105 million that the Premier League are concerned about. So I think Villa will know this coming season they've got plenty to look forward to in terms of additional revenue. But this is, I think it's a small bit of pain they probably knew was coming down the tracks if they wanted to be successful.
It's interesting that you mentioned Nassif Sawiris because him and Wes Edens don't make public utterances very, very much. Obviously, Nassif Sawiris gave an interview to the Financial Times, and this is what he said. And I've ripped this from an article you've done, Dave, so apologies for plagiarising your work. But some of the rules have actually resulted in cementing the status quo more than creating upward mobility and fluidity in the sport. The rules do not make sense and are not good for football. Managing a sports team has become more like being a treasurer or a bean counter rather than looking at what your team needs. It's more about creating paper profits, not real profits. It becomes a financial game, not a sporting game. So I think those comments, those are quite strong comments, but coming alongside the fact that Villa were trying to get this loss allowance kind of extended to 130 million a season. Do you think almost that's Aston Villa's hierarchy saying, well, we've tried to do it the way that your system allows us to do. So if we're now going to try and go rogue a little bit and exploit a loophole, you've only got yourself to blame, because you are deliberately, I don't know, protecting the elite and keeping pesky upstarts like us down. Do you think they've almost kind of got the retaliation in first?
Yeah, I think so. And I think they would have been hoping for more support than they got on what they were asking to do. I'm in the camp of, with my kind of completely objective hat on, I'm in the camp of it is wrong, really. And I don't see an issue with, I don't think this is a loophole even. It's just something that clubs are allowed to do. You know, it's the fact that regulation hasn't kept pace with the growth of the Premier League. I mean, the Premier League is one of Britain's biggest exports now, certainly in terms of, it's our biggest entertainment export, and it has global touch points. It's hugely important culturally for us in Britain and for how we are viewed across the world now, because ultimately the Premier League is the most viewed domestic competition in world football. There's a reason why the Saudi Arabian PIF wanted to by Newcastle, and why it was allowed, because it's, there's simpatico relationships to be had. But there is, it hasn't moved, the regulation with this 105 million hasn't moved with the growth of the game, which means it has negatively impacted those who have to spend more and have to rely on ownership help more to make up the fact that they can't draw in commercial revenues the same level as Manchester United, Manchester City, Liverpool. They just can't, because they're not brands of the same level. I mean, they've been playing these competitions for the same amount of time. To us here in the UK, they are just, I mean, we have a different view of big teams over here through the prism of the English game, I think, because we look at clubs like Villa, European champions in their history. We look at clubs like Leeds and, the historically massive clubs. It's not always been United and Liverpool. Chelsea is a construct of being able to spend money before financial regulation arrived properly in 2012. Same for Manchester City. That was during that period of time, you had Roman Abramovich, Sheikh Mansour come into those respective clubs. They pour money into it to huge levels. Chelsea actually changed the dynamic of the transfer window forever from 2004 when Abramovich came in. So those clubs were allowed to do that because there was no regulation. They broke no rules in doing that. But now, to be obstructive around other clubs trying to be more competitive and allowing more ownership spend. I mean, you have to have, I am a believer that you have to have some handbrake on how much owners can spend, because that's when you run the risk of it becomes farcical. There's a real case there, and why Villa were bang on in being able to trying to raise this PSR limit to 130, because it just hasn't kept in line with inflation. I mean, that's a very basic thing to me that this should have been taken into account. It costs far more to run a club, so losses therefore are greater. The risk of loss is greater. So it's not really, nothing is kept pace. So I think Sawir is well within his rights to be angry. And I bet there are a few more who will be of a similar mindset. I imagine Newcastle ownership would love to have kind of freer reign to do what they want. But for Villa, they're in that unique position of they've cracked it without spending it. And you've got Chelsea on the outside looking in, having spent £1 billion in transfer money, but selling their own homegrown players for profit and selling hotels and all sorts. Yet they seem to be placing themselves in a position to be able to go for Champions League football regularly in a big way in the coming years. But Villa are not going to have that luxury unless they carry on this success. They get in the Champions League again next season, and then they make this a recurring revenue stream like the top 4 or 5 clubs do, because they know they're going to get 70, 80, 90, 100 million coming to the door every year. For Villa, it can't just be a one-off. But how do you invest in making that something for every year? You have to spend money, but they're not allowed to spend money. So it's a vicious circle.
I mean, it's not necessarily a new thing, is it, this Dave? Because even looking at it through an Aston Villa lens, last summer Villa have sold Cameron Archer, Philogene Bidace, Aaron Ramsey. for fairly sizable fees, given each of those players' level of first team experience. And listen, every fan base will got a siege mentality, think everybody's out to get us and stuff. But there does seem to be a lot, and you can't use social media necessarily as a great barometer, but there does seem to be a lot of angst coming Villa's way this year, as opposed to those deals last year slipped under the radar. Is that because Villa are seen now? Before they were just kind of hovering around the European places. Now they've managed to burst into that Champions League territory. Do you think it does come with the territory of fan bases, owners, football clubs in general? If you try and disrupt something that they've had their own way for a long period of time, you're going to be treated as these kind of, these annoying outsiders who need to be kept in their place.
Those who have had don't like having it taken away or threatened to a greater extent, because these, the biggest clubs have been built on success annually, and they've built the brands on it. And at this crucial time in football, when it's changing, we have like a generational shift. The way we consume football is different, and the way different generations consume football is different. We have different markets now. I mean, who would have thought back in 1994 that the US would be such a fertile market for English football, whereby it could actually help save the growth of the Premier League, because our own domestic rights are starting to flatline a little bit, or stagnate rather, and the US wants to continue to rise. People don't want this disrupted at this crucial time. They don't want noisy neighbours. They want people to play their role in the Premier League soap opera. And if you've got designs to actually be there, be part of this for the long run, and start getting yourself at the table and eating someone else's food, that's when people have a problem with it. And that's when you will have, there will be a significant amount of kind of pushback from trying to make that happen. I mean, selling kind of homegrown products has been the Chelsea model now for a good long while, but it's actually enabled their transfer spend over the past 2 years. And also, I saw a notion, kind of people saying how crazy it was that people were inflating transfer fees, and how could someone like Tim Irogbonam be worth 9 million? How is Lewis Dobbin worth 10 million? How is Amari Kellyman worth 19 million? Because they are, because someone was willing to pay for it. How was Rhian Brewster worth 25 million? How was Jordan Ibe worth 15 million? It's like football club valuations. They are worth what someone is willing to pay. It's like anything. If if you are worth what someone is willing to pay, that is it. Sponsorships are different because there is a market value to sponsorships. It's quite obvious, but you can value talent in a completely different way. I find that a completely kind of flawed argument to say these values can be inflated. I mean, you don't know. You could be selling a player for 19 million in Kellyman who turns out to be a 75, 80 million player. You don't know that. This is the risk taken. So there's no way of ever seeing that. So Villa are noisy neighbours now, and it's and they did it with structure and strategy, but also with people with smarts and connections and money who are willing to play a long game with this. That means that the biggest clubs have got to continue to work and try and push the envelope. And I don't always like doing that because they haven't been challenged in a big way for a while, but which is why I think it's a real shame that Villa haven't been allowed to really. I think with having the ability to spend a little bit more, maybe the strength to keep hold of a Douglas Luiz and add players around that, I think it would have made for a really, really interesting coming season. I still think they'll be good, but they're starting with from 2 steps behind again, and it's deeply unfair.
Do you actually think Villa have been pretty shrewd with the way they have circumnavigated the rules as they currently are?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there has to be some element of give, and Douglas Luiz is the give. Now, that I'm only using reported figures. I've no insight into what the figures were, but 43 million was saved. So they did a separate deal for Douglas Luiz. So it's 43 million, and there's a piece I wrote which kind of explains through that. So player trading profit is the profit in the books. So players have book value, which is held. So when you buy a player for X amount, that transfer fee, the guaranteed sum, not add-ons, is amortized over the life of a contract. So it's transfer fee divided by length of the contract. Now, the maximum that period can be now is 5 years. Chelsea were doing 7, 8, 9. Changed over the past 12 months. So that's how the figures are amortized. But when you sell a player, you can book that whole profit straight away. You don't have to, you can spread the cost of signing players. So I think Douglas Luiz still had a remaining book value of 3 million. So anything above 3 million is profit for Villa. And that was because they extended his contract in 2022. So that spreads that initial 15 million fee out on however much had been paid off it over another 2 years. So it becomes even smaller annually. So above that was profit. Then I think there was a sell-on clause with City. So when you take that out, I mean, you're looking at 30-odd million pound profit, which is very healthy. Then you factor in Kellyman, so say 19 million. Say that's pure profit. I'm not too sure whether that's all guaranteed some up front. Then you factor in Tim Irogbenam going to Everton, and before you know it, you're on almost 60 million pounds worth of player profit. But you've lost one first teamer, really. One key player, yes, but you've lost him. You can still replace that player in the transfer window, but you can do it in the next financial year. Yeah. So, but what they have done before, they've still been able to bring in that financial year Jan Matson, who was one of Borussia Dortmund's standout players last season, and someone that Chelsea probably wouldn't wanted to have sold, but kind of had to continue their own, and they're stacked in that position anyway, their own transfer spend. So they've signed him 37.5 million. Okay, that's 7.5 million annually they're paying. And then they've also brought in Samuel Edding Jr., Enzo Barandiquer, is it, from Juventus? I don't know whether that's how you say his name. But those two players, 18.5 million combined, and amortized, that cost is, assuming the 5-year contracts, £3.5 million. Then Lewis Dobbin, £2 million. So you've got outlays of £13 million annually for the almost £60 million you brought in. So your player profit turns out being mid-40s. That's enough to get Villa over the line for PSR. And they've signed 4 players, sold 3. 2 of them were academy graduates. And they have brought in a Champions League finalist within that. And then it ticks over into the new financial year with revenues from the Champions League, an Adidas deal, which will be far bigger than the Castor deal, a new sponsorship deal with Bertano, and all the riches that come with additional matchday revenue from having 2 extra games in the Champions League from the usual 2 that they would get. They'll now get guaranteed 4 because there's 8 games minimum. You are already looking at being able to spend more. So guess what? They'll be able to, they'll back themselves to try and find an adequate Douglas Luiz replacement in the new financial year. But they had to have some element of a make way. And in doing this deal they've had with Juventus, it means they've been able to add 2 potentially impactful players, as well as make a considerable profit on a player who they will feel that they can probably do a good job of trying to replace in a new financial year.
It's really, really, really fascinating talking to you, Dave. The more I speak to you, we're always lauding Unai Emery and his coaching staff and his recruitment staff, and what we think for now certainly seem to be the perfect owners that have taken Villa from the brink of obliteration to Champions League football. The more I listen to you, the more I think, I don't even know, this is probably remiss of me, these Villa fans listening to this, I'm sure, are a lot better informed than I am. Chief financial officer at a football club now must have become, I know it's always been the important thing, well, certainly since the Premier League boom, but that is such a crucial role, isn't it, to make sure that you can exist within this bandwidth that you've got because of these regulations.
They are hugely important to football clubs now. There are teams and teams of these, whether it's accountants or finance officers, their teams on because it's so important to remain within these regulations. But so never has it been more important to have strong leadership from a commercial aspect as well. I know Chris Heck came in at Villa, I think ruffled a few feathers according to some reports in terms of having to change over from some existing deals that were in place and move into new improved deals. But obviously when you do that, you incur break charges from breaking off with existing commercial partners. But sometimes that's just that's a cold, hard way of having to do business for what's best for the long run. Now, Villa will have had to swallow those costs, but the long term is far rosier. I mean, and Nassif Sawiris has, he's a stakeholder in Adidas. So you look at the way what Villa want to become a global brand, getting product into the hands and merchandise into the hands of global fans. I mean, you need a global partner, which is why they got Adidas. So I think it's not just the fact that finance officers are so important. I think it's they put a lot of good leadership knows that they have to have a good management team in place and leadership team in place across the board, which has to make tough decisions. And I think that's what has happened at Villa. I think there's been a probably cultural change there, and that will continue. I mean, it's run like a business, but it has to, every element of the business has to wash its face and show its delivery. And I imagine that's what's happening. But yeah, to have a strong financial officer who knows the ins and outs and knows how much you can and can't do and how much wiggle room you've got at any moment in time is ultimately is hugely important. And that's what Villa will know. They'll know precisely how much they can spend. But I imagine this year they'll be right on the button when it comes to PSR. But that's all they need to be. Slate wipes clean next year, and they can find with new revenues. I think it's quite the outlook is quite rosy, really.
Just finally, Dave, I know you've suggested that the various bits of manoeuvring that Villa have done, reportedly done in the last couple of weeks, would seem to have got them where they need to be. Do you expect a flurry of business either from Villa or any of those other affected clubs that we've mentioned earlier? Do you expect that to still be a little bit of I suppose movement between now and that Sunday night deadline?
Yeah, I do, if they can. I mean, any club, even if Villa see the opportunity to, because we're in this strange period where there's a few clubs who are willing buyers for these academy players, provided there's willing buyers for their own. And I think if opportunity knocks, then I think it would happen. But I think the onus is now less on Villa. I think Everton are almost there as well with what they need to do, which I'm glad about, because I think it'd be a incredibly sad situation to have to punish another club again in 3. So, and given the other things which have been going on out of the control, I think it's about time that their fans had a break. But I think Newcastle will have work to do. Specifically Newcastle, I think they'll have work to do because, I mean, there's talk of Alexander Isak, and I know they have a considerable PSR gap to make up. I mean, while they had additional revenue from the Champions League last year, it wasn't as much as they possibly hoped. I mean, I think they banked about 30-odd million, but there was 2 less games than what Villa will have this season. And also they spent considerably to acquire talent, and with that comes, higher costs, higher wages. So I imagine they'll have to try and move on players to remain compliant and won't be able to add in the same way that that Villa have so close to the end of this window, which means it kicks on into the next window, which means it carries that stress and strain over into another financial window where Villa have already brought in 4 players, in the final days of a window where they had PSR concerns. So I think looking at all this, I think Villa are kind of the big winners of this mini transfer window that we've seen. But I think there will be a few more moving players around to try and just give themselves that breathing space, and even just to reduce losses. So the time, when they can consider next year's accounts themselves, it's things look a little bit better again. But I think Villa are, I think they probably have to be applauded really for how they've managed to approach this back end of this mini transfer window at the moment, and still come out still having a strong squad, but albeit needing to replace Douglas Luiz. But they can do that, as I said, in a new financial year.
I think I've introduced you as our financial guru. You've definitely lived up to the billion. I know I feel a lot more clued up now. Just for those of you who haven't encountered Dave before, Dave's our business of football writer, so writes across Birmingham Live and all of our titles across Reach, so Liverpool Echo, Football London, Manchester Evening News, and also I want to, because he's given up his time to talk us through what I think can be a difficult thing to understand if you're a layman like me. Dave does a brilliant, I suppose, football-wide newsletter as well called The Bottom Line. So we'll make sure that we link out to that in the description as well. But appreciate it, Dave. Big friend of Claret and Blue as well. So we always.
I love it. Fans have been dead nice. I enjoy coming on. It's a pleasure. Like I say, I'm hopeful that that kind of it's going to be quite a rosy future. But as I said, no one likes the elite being broken up. So in fact, a few bloody noses on the way, I think.
That's it. In 15 years' time, when Villa are running the show, we'll be trying to protect what's ours as well. Then, won't we? So
there we go. That's the way it is. We're playing football on Mars.
No, brilliant. Until next time, you've been watching Claret and Blue. Up the Villa.